Tyrion Lannister was born beneath a sky the color of molten gold. Or so the midwives would later claim when the minstrels and bards fashioned new legends out of old tragedies, spinning songs that flickered across western hearths like living flame. In truth, the night of his birth was a cold, wind-swept affair of black clouds and howling wind, though to anyone living in the glow of his father's eventual regard, it might as well have been the dawn of some illustrious new era. No one could ignore the first wailing cries that filled the Lannister halls, carrying high and sharp through the gloom, an echo of the squealing wind. It was a small sound, but it had enough determination to rattle the air. Lord Tywin, usually as unmovable as a mountain, paced the corridor outside his lady's birthing chamber that night, the gold in his hair streaked by fresh lines of silver. He was a stoic man, famed across the 7 kingdoms for his iron will and the intimidation it wrought, yet servants whispered that his face was pale that evening. Casterly Rock's torches shuddered along its carved stone walls as though in sympathy with Joanna Lannister's labor. By the time the blood had been spilt and the ordeal had ended, Tyrion had arrived, but Joanna had been lost. This tragedy was undisputed, as was the child's deformity. Tywin's face was stern as a granite carving when he first saw the babe. Tyrion was small, half the size of an ordinary infant, it seemed, and cursed with mismatched eyes that glinted with the cunning of a Lannister lion in one, and a shade that belonged in a ghost story in the other. The swirl of dark rumor that accompanied his birth could have grown into something monstrous had Tywin chosen to nurture his suspicions. Indeed, in another life perhaps he would have. There were many who believed that the boy was ill-omened, many who assumed that Tywin would hate him. But on that night, as the boy blinked up at his father, too weak to cry again, the new lord who had just lost his beloved wife recalled her last words. "Love him, Tywin." It was said in panted breath, in that thin line between life and death, that Joanna had told him to keep their child safe. Some insisted it was only the muffled delirium of a dying woman. Yet Tywin remembered how her eyes had met his, full of a heartbreak that threatened to sunder him. And so, with pain roiling in the hollow of his chest, Tywin gathered Tyrion into his arms with a gentleness no one ever expected from him. He swallowed his bitterness, swallowed his tears as well, and from that night forward he resolved that Tyrion Lannister, despite his twisted legs and stunted form, would carry the future of House Lannister. The child had cost him Joanna, but the child would be cherished nonetheless. Throughout his childhood, Tyrion felt his father's influence in every aspect of his life. The first time he remembered a sense of warmth in Tywin's stern regard was when he was 5 years old. He had slipped into the Lord Solar without knocking. Tywin, engrossed in a ledger, scarcely looked up until Tyrion began reciting the sums and expenditures he spotted from the vantage of a stool. Numbers never daunted him. They seemed to dance and reorder themselves at his command. His father, a master of accounts and strategy, had never expected such quick wits from one so young, least of all from a boy whose birth had seemed so fraught with ill luck. "How did you come to understand all this, Tyrion?" Tywin asked, his voice heavy as rolling thunder. Tyrion shrugged with what childlike innocence he could muster. "I read, father," he said, gesturing at the books on the high shelves, "though it's easier to climb them at night when you're asleep." Any other father in the 7 kingdoms might have scolded him. Tywin, however, found a rare sense of pride swelling in his chest. He turned the ledger to face Tyrion and said, "Show me." It was a moment that Tyrion would forever sear into his mind. Acceptance. There was a small corner of Tywin's soul that thawed that day, forging a bond with the boy many had thought doomed to be an outcast. In the years that followed, Tyrion found himself invited into matters of import around the rock. He listened from the shadows during many of Tywin's meetings, picking up on alliances, debts, long-grudging feuds. He learned the importance of gold, the importance of reputation, and above all the importance of acting with purpose. In those days, Jaime and Cersei were older children on the cusp of adolescence, shining and glorious in their typical Lannister way. Both tall, both fair, each carrying themselves with the leonine grace that their father esteemed. Tyrion was never physically gifted like Jaime, never possessed the coldly glittering beauty of Cersei. And yet Tywin's gaze often lingered upon Tyrion more than on the other two. "The mind is a weapon," Tywin had explained one day, "and you have the facility to sharpen it better than anyone. I will teach you all that I can, so that one day, when my watch ends, you will carry the name Lannister forward." He did not say this lightly. Tywin rarely doled out compliments, and rarer still did he speak of the future as though it was a matter of hope rather than inevitability. But for Tyrion, this was all the impetus he needed to consume volumes of scholarship, to study the art of letters, the intricacies of trade, the intangible tools of politicking, and the labyrinthine roads of warfare. He pored over the histories of old Valyria, the expansions under Targaryen rule, and the rebellions that shaped the Seven Kingdoms. He became adept at analyzing the histories of family alliances throughout Westeros, predicting how new tensions might erupt. At a mere 12 years old, Tyrion was often more informed about the houses of the Crownlands and the Stormlands than lords thrice his age. Cersei sneered at him often. It was impossible not to see the flicker of distaste in her emerald eyes, as though every time she beheld her littlest brother, she saw the bitter memory of their mother's death. Jaime, for his part, tried to remain congenial. He was ever an affable soul, if carefree and prone to vanity. Yet even Jaime sometimes wore a look of pity or awkwardness whenever Tyrion was forced to scramble his short legs up into a saddle or totter across the yard. But Tywin's pride overshadowed their quiet scorn. He demanded excellence of Tyrion, and in exchange offered him the dignity that few dwarfs would ever know. The pair became an unlikely duo, forging something akin to a friendship in the eyes of the household. It did not fill the hollow in Tywin's heart where Joanna belonged, but it eased it somewhat. Perhaps, in his own fearsome way, Tywin saw in Tyrion not only a reflection of his own cunning, but also the bright intelligence that had once shone in Joanna. He would never speak of it, and Tyrion, too, rarely pried into his mother's memory. It was a place too sacred to tread carelessly. Years blurred, and Tyrion grew in mind if not in stature. By the time he was a young man, he had already managed certain affairs on behalf of Casterly Rock. At 16, he discovered that many lords of the Westerlands found his presence jarring but effective. They entered the Solar expecting a lesser creature, ridiculing a dwarf behind their polite smiles, only to leave astonished by the weight of his words. Tywin recognized this advantage. He once confided to Tyrion that underestimation was often a more potent weapon than even the famed gold of House Lannister. Meanwhile, Jaime joined the Kingsguard under King Aerys II Targaryen's reign, a choice that many whispered had more to do with Tywin's frustrations with the Mad King than with Jaime's own aspirations. Cersei, always ambitious, pinned her hopes on becoming a queen one day, though Tywin's attention on Tyrion made her seethe with envy. She dreaded that her father might set aside her own significance. Tywin had always wanted to wed Cersei to Rhaegar Targaryen, or so the rumor went, but that plan had fallen through, leaving Cersei dissatisfied. Tyrion observed all of it with a careful eye. He studied his siblings, recognized their strengths and weaknesses, and cultivated a private sympathy for Jaime, who found himself more and more stuck within an oath-bound job at the Mad King's side. Tyrion also recognized that Cersei's bitterness could easily metamorphose into something dangerous, for she wanted greatness and felt it was slipping through her grasp. He tried to engage her in conversation many a time, but she never forgot that he had cost them their mother. She never forgot that her father's greatest pride was now pinned on him rather than her beloved Jaime. And so a quiet cold war settled between Tyrion and Cersei, one that Tywin, in his calculating manner, sought to quell with a mixture of diplomacy and warnings to his daughter. Cersei obeyed outwardly, though inwardly the resentment festered. When the flames of Robert's rebellion began to lick at the realm, Tywin found an eager participant in Tyrion for charting the future of their house. While Tywin waited at Casterly Rock for an opportune time to intervene in the conflict, both father and son weighed the shifting balances of the war. Tactically, Tywin wanted to preserve House Lannister's strength, but also ensure that they picked the winning side. They had no love for the Mad King. They needed to determine whether to support the Targaryens or to join the rebels led by Robert Baratheon and Eddard Stark. In that uneasy stretch of months, Tyrion carefully parsed every dispatch, every rumor from the field, matching wits with Tywin over possible outcomes. The difference between victory and ruin could hinge on a single miscalculation. Some nights, Tyrion would remain awake, poring over accounts and speculation, then present his father with his findings at dawn. Tywin, for all his measured stoicism, would feel a proud heat in his chest upon hearing his son's analyses. When the Trident's outcome became clear, it was Tyrion who first advised Tywin they must march without delay, present themselves as allies to Robert, and open the gates of King's Landing. Tywin, wanting to shield Tyrion from the ugliest side of war, left him to govern the Rock in his stead while the Lannister host descended upon the capital. Tyrion followed the war's progression from a distance, reading meticulously through letters from couriers that arrived each day. He read, too, the names of the dead silver-haired princes, knights, and foot soldiers lost to steel and fire, and he read of the city's sack. It would later haunt him, the knowledge that Lannister men had ravaged King's Landing so thoroughly. But Tywin sent a message praising the role Tyrion had played in advising him to choose the winning side at the optimal moment, ensuring the Lannisters' place in the new order. Perhaps that was the last time Tywin and Tyrion found themselves entirely on the same page, for after the rebellion, the moral weight of what had been done sat heavily on Tyrion's mind. Still, the realm named House Lannister the king's new allies under Robert's rule. Tywin's cunning had once again borne fruit, with Tyrion quietly behind much of it. King Robert took Cersei to wife as part of the arrangement. Tywin did not protest. It was a fortuitous match. By then, Jaime was the Kingslayer, bound to the Kingsguard under the new king. Tyrion often traveled to King's Landing, where he learned how to navigate the labyrinthine court. Though he was no fan of Robert, who was loud and bawdy and more interested in tournaments and feasts than in good governance, Tyrion recognized the importance of forging alliances. Robert, for his part, came to find Tyrion quite amusing, as the dwarf's acerbic wit could liven even the dullest day in the Red Keep. Tyrion understood the court with an intuition that set him apart from many lords who only knew how to brandish swords or toast their own accomplishments. He built friendships with the Master of Whispers, Varys, trading carefully gleaned secrets for knowledge that might help the Lannisters maintain their ascendancy. He became acquainted with Littlefinger and gleaned an immediate sense of caution. He studied Pycelle's pomposities, recognized them as the fronts of an old man too entrenched in politics to be harmless, and he formed a respectful rapport with Jon Arryn, who was then still Hand of the King. By the time the realm had settled into something resembling peace under Robert, Tyrion was nearing 30. Casterly Rock was more or less under his oversight, as Tywin had officially named him heir. While Jaime was sworn to the Kingsguard and thus unable to inherit, Cersei was queen, presumably too high in station to rule the Westerlands, though that suited her just fine. She had her own seat of power at the capital. This shift in family dynamics did not occur without friction. Some among the Westerland lords grumbled about a dwarf being the heir, no matter how clever he was. But Tywin quashed such dissent with the threat of withheld gold or the unsubtle presence of the Lannister armies. None who recognized the steel beneath Tywin's gaze dared protest in the open. Tyrion himself was not ignorant of these whispers. At first, they wounded him. He may have been favored by his father. He may have tasted the power of political cunning. But the dwarfish stigma did not vanish simply because Tywin willed it so. Still, Tyrion learned to use his dwarfish nature as camouflage. He played the fool when it served him, reaped the rewards of being dismissed or underestimated, and then struck with insight when it mattered most. One by one, lords came to realize that Tyrion Lannister was not to be trifled with. He knew their ledgers, their debts, their shameful secrets, and possibly their wives' secrets too. The best route was to bend the knee and secure a place in his good graces. And yet, despite these victories, Cersei's rancor did not fade. In King's Landing, she watched Robert indulge in drink and women, saw him father bastards all over the city, and felt her own illusions of being the precious gem in her father's eyes slip away. Tywin was more proud of Tyrion's exploits in the Westerlands than of Cersei's precarious attempts at controlling Robert's court. And Jaime, her twin, though dear to her, belonged to the Kingsguard now, pledged to protect Robert, whom she loathed. In letters to Tywin, She sometimes made veiled insinuations that Tyrion should be more concerned with marrying and producing an heir, or that Tyrion's place as favored child was an affront to the memory of Joanna. Tywin always rebuked her quietly, reminding her that her own marriage to the king had done much for the family. House Lannister was ascendant, and that was paramount. Tyrion's sense of family, ironically, was stronger than either sibling gave him credit for. He disliked Cersei's coldness, but he tried from time to send her thoughtful gifts, unusual books from Essos, or lavish gold ornaments that might suit her attire. He also took pains to keep Jaime informed of the goings-on in Casterly Rock, knowing his brother missed the place. Tyrion yearned, on some private level, for them to unite as a family in truth. House Lannister, under his father's leadership, had become a formidable power in Westeros, but the Leonine sigil stood for more than just might. It stood for cunning, for unity, for legacy. It came as a shock to many when Tyrion finally decided to take a wife, not as a matter of forced arrangement, but seemingly of his own volition. By the time he was well into adulthood, Tywin would have happily arranged a marriage with some advantageous alliance, for instance, a Tyrell cousin or a Tully second daughter, to consolidate House Lannister's reach. Yet Tyrion, who had few illusions about how he might be perceived, refused any bride who came purely out of obligation and the desire to gain Lannister gold. He wanted a companion whose mind he could admire, if not love. That was a tall order for a dwarf who was known for his silver tongue and sly wit, but whose presence was still an oddity in many a lord's hall. At last, an accord was struck with House Martell of Dorne, surprisingly. Prince Doran Martell had a niece, Elia Sand, not of official Martell lineage, but recognized as a noble bastard with a sharp intellect and rumored to be as well-versed in negotiation as her cousin, the fabled Red Viper. Elia had olive skin, expressive eyes, and a forceful spirit that refused to let others shame her for her bastard birth. When negotiations began, Tywin was initially wary. Dorne had little love for the Lannisters, given the circumstances of Elia Targaryen's death at the sack of King's Landing. But Tyrion, ever the clever broker, recognized an opportunity to bind old wounds. If House Lannister and House Martell could set aside past grievances, it would greatly stabilize the realm, and it might help quell the simmering discontent that lingered in the Dornish hearts. Elia Sand arrived at Casterly Rock in a swirl of desert silks, her presence at once regal and defiant. To everyone's surprise, she did not blanch at Tyrion's appearance. Instead, she challenged him with pointed questions about the future he wanted for the Rock, about his opinions on trade routes through the Dornish marches, about the usage of wealth in times of war. She possessed a certain bright defiance that flared like a candle in a dark room. Tyrion was enthralled, and even Tywin found himself respecting her forthrightness. They married in a ceremony that raised a few eyebrows among the Westerland nobility, who had expected Tyrion to wed someone of more impeccable lineage. But the alliance was undeniably beneficial. It set tongues wagging across the Seven Kingdoms. By forging this unexpected bond, Tyrion had further cemented House Lannister as a power that could transcend old hatreds. He was also mindful of the possibility that, if treated well, Elia's Dornish kin would not only be new trade partners but also potential defenders of Lannister interests should future strife arise. Thus began the next phase of Tyrion's life. He was no longer simply the overshadowed dwarf or the brilliant heir overshadowing others. He was Lord Tyrion, favored child of Tywin, forging a path none had imagined. In time, he discovered that Elia's wit was a match for his own, and though the realm saw theirs as a marriage of convenience, there was genuine respect between them. She even taught him about the heat and passions of Dorne, introduced him to spicy dishes that nearly burned his throat, and teased him for reading so many tomes that his eyes might shrivel. He, in turn, revealed the archives of the Rock to her, the records of old trades and conquests, the genealogical charts of noble houses across Westeros. They would stay up late discussing what the realm might look like in 100 years if peace could last. All the while, Tywin watched from his vantage as a storm began to brew in the east. Word spread that Daenerys Targaryen, last surviving daughter of Aerys II, had wed a Dothraki warlord. Whispers of dragons were uttered in hushed tones throughout King's Landing and beyond. Another rumor circulated, that the Targaryen exiled prince, Viserys, might rally supporters to press his claim on the Iron Throne. Tyrion was not overly concerned. Exiles often made empty threats, and the realm was not so easily shaken by a Targaryen remnant with no resources. But still, the knowledge lingered, a faint rattle at the edges of the map. The more pressing matter was the tension between Robert and the Lannisters. Robert's extravagance had drained the royal treasury, to the point that the crown now owed substantial sums to House Lannister. Tywin, with Tyrion at his side, had become the realm's de facto banker. This was a delicate matter, for the crown's dependence on Lannister gold gave Tywin extraordinary influence, but it also stoked Robert's resentments. Cersei was trapped in a loveless marriage with a king who despised her father's hold over the throne's purse. The Tyrells simmered with a rival pride in Highgarden, while the Starks remained in the north, distant and none too fond of Lannister arrogance. Tyrion recognized that if ever the realm fell into turmoil, House Lannister's position at the apex would make them a target for envy and scorn. Then came the fateful events that kindled war: the death of Jon Arryn, the rumored involvement of the Lannisters, the arrival of King Robert and the royal retinue in Winterfell, and an apparent attempt on Bran Stark's life that some claimed was tied to Lannister gold. In the original span of things, Tyrion might have found himself an outcast, embroiled in bitter accusations and forced into precarious positions. But in this version of events, Tyrion commanded Tywin's unconditional support, and Tywin refused to let rumors swirl unchecked. He rallied the great lords of the Westerlands, demanded a thorough investigation, and insisted to Robert's face that House Lannister would never stoop to harming a child, particularly not over such trifling matters. Tyrion himself volunteered to go north and speak to Eddard Stark to soothe tensions, for he believed in the power of diplomacy. The night before Tyrion departed, Cersei cornered him in a dim corridor of the Red Keep, her eyes glittering. "You think you can talk sense into the Starks? They are an honor-bound clan, full of illusions." Tyrion studied her carefully, wondering if she was behind Bran Stark's near demise. He had no direct proof, and confronted by her father's unyielding favor of Tyrion, Cersei had grown subtler. She only stared at him in that scornful way of hers, lips curled as though she smelled something rancid. "What do you want, Cersei?" he asked calmly. She approached him, chin high. "We stand at the edge of a knife. If Lord Stark learns anything that might implicate us in wrongdoing, the entire realm could collapse into chaos, and you and I both know Father won't let that happen. He would rather see the Starks burn." "It won't come to that," Tyrion said. "I have no intention of turning Eddard Stark into our sworn enemy. The realm can ill afford civil strife, especially not with debts mounting and the Targaryen girl possibly stirring trouble across the sea." He paused. "Besides, I would rather see the realm united, for once, than ground to dust beneath warring lords." Her laugh was a cold, mirthless sound. "You've always been too fond of illusions, little brother, if you think you can charm the wolves. Father may cling to your counsel, but I've lived in King's Landing long enough to know that none of us can trust the Starks. They're as proud as we are." He shrugged, stepping around her. "Perhaps we are both illusions, then, lions in a cage of gold." He left her there in the torchlight, uncertain if she had indeed orchestrated the attempt on the boy or if she was merely relieved that someone else had done so. Tyrion's journey to Winterfell was uneventful, aside from his curiosity at visiting the crypts beneath the fortress, where the old Stark kings of winter were interred. He found the north bracingly cold, but its people warm in their own curt, stoic way. He met with Eddard Stark, who wore suspicion in his gray eyes like a mantle. Ned asked him outright if House Lannister was behind the attempt on his son's life, and Tyrion, with all the sincerity he could muster, denied any involvement. "We do not stoop to murdering children for the sake of covering up secrets," he said plainly. "Any man who would do such a thing is no true Lannister." Ned still bristled, for trust was not earned easily when the stakes were so high. But Tyrion's presence, rather than that of Jaime or Cersei, was like a bomb. With his quick wit and self-deprecating charm, Tyrion managed to dissipate some of the tension, claiming that if the boy ever woke, the truth would come out. Moreover, Tyrion extended an invitation of goodwill. The North could rely on Lannister gold to support any needed improvements to the King's Road or the fostering of trade in White Harbor. Tywin, in his letters, had explicitly granted Tyrion authority to promise such concessions. He wanted peace, at least for now, and was willing to pay dearly to maintain it. During this northern sojourn, Tyrion also formed a tentative rapport with Robb Stark, the young heir. Robb was proud, but also curious, and the banter with Tyrion provided him with a glimpse into the wider realm. Bran remained in his coma. Tyrion asked if he might see the boy, if only to assure himself that House Lannister had not committed some monstrous act. Ned, hesitant, eventually relented. Tyrion looked upon Bran with genuine pity, seeing a child whose life might be forever marred. But seeing him also fed Tyrion's resolve. If the Lannisters had no hand in this, they must do everything possible to prove it, for if truth came out otherwise, it would doom them all. When news came that Bran had awakened and spoken only vaguely of a fall, no mention of who caused it, Tyrion breathed a sigh of relief. He parted from Winterfell on cordial, if distant terms, with Ned Stark. There was no alliance or warm bond, but at least open war was not on the horizon. The goodwill might have lasted, had not other intrigues intervened. Upon returning south, Tyrion learned that King Robert planned a grand tournament to celebrate the naming of Eddard Stark as Hand. Tensions simmered anew when it became evident that the treasury was nearly empty, forcing the Lannisters to once again float alone to the crown. It was a precarious dance. Robert's pride chafed under the knowledge that he needed Lannister gold, yet he and Tywin both recognized they could not alienate each other. Cersei's continued frustration at Robert's drunken appetites lent a brittle edge to court life. Jaime was restless in his Kingsguard role, too aware of the swirling intrigue. Varys's little birds whispered about bastards in Flea Bottom, about Catelyn Stark seizing Tyrion if she found any pretext, about plotters in the Vale. Tyrion did his best to use his vantage as the favored Lannister to orchestrate a sense of calm. He had the ear of the king when Robert wasn't deep in his cups, and that of the Hand, albeit grudgingly. Tywin, from Casterly Rock, sent warnings that if the situation in King's Landing escalated, Tyrion must bring the might of House Lannister to bear. Tyrion always promised he would do what was necessary, though in his heart he hated the thought of unleashing Tywin's armies on the capital. Still, some events proved impossible to quell with gold or words. Tension continued to mount around the question of the Targaryen girl overseas. Should King Robert have her assassinated or not? Ned Stark balked, calling it murder. Cersei spurred Robert's worst impulses, whispering that Daenerys was a threat to all. Tyrion, hoping to avert a crisis, argued that assassinating a pregnant girl across the narrow sea might only stoke further illusions of Targaryen martyrdom. Better to let her alone, he counseled, for we have no confirmation she truly has dragons or a Dothraki horde ready to cross the sea. Even if she does, the Dothraki fear water. Robert, in a rare moment of sobriety, found merit in Tyrion's words, but behind the scenes, Cersei maneuvered to keep the plan alive. In the midst of this, Elia Sand joined Tyrion in King's Landing. She wanted to see the capital for herself, to meet her husband's family in their element. She found the city stinking of refuse, but also humming with vibrancy, markets bursting with curiosities from across the world. She met Cersei, who greeted her with icy politeness, and Jaime, who was at least courteous enough to congratulate her on the marriage. Elaya's presence gave Tyrion a measure of emotional support he rarely had in the capital. She saw how he wrestled with court intrigues, how he tried to balance loyalty to his father with the needs of the realm. As the realm's jitters grew, Ned Stark discovered secrets about Robert's bastards, discovered that the royal children born to Cersei were questionable in paternity. In the original timeline, this would have sparked immediate conflict, culminating in Ned's downfall. But here, Ned was more cautious, having already glimpsed a different side to the Lannisters through Tyrion. He did not reveal his suspicions so openly. Instead, he requested a meeting with Tyrion, wanting to gauge whether the imp had any knowledge of this vile deception. Tyrion, however, was as shocked as anyone. In truth, he had suspected the children might be fathered by Jaime. He was too clever not to notice resemblances. but he had never fully confronted that possibility. Now, faced with Ned Stark's direct claims, Tyrion had to choose between blind loyalty to his family or acknowledging the horrifying consequences of incestuous scandal. If the rumor spread that King Robert's heirs were not truly his, that would cast the entire monarchy into chaos. Many would call for the execution of the Queen and the Kingsguard Knight who fathered her children, especially because of the Mad King's downfall. Robert might go mad with betrayal and demand Lannister heads. War could erupt between the Crown and the Rock. Tyrion weighed the unthinkable scenarios as Ned Stark awaited his response, those gray eyes flinty with both dread and hope. With measured words, Tyrion said, "If it's true that the heirs are not Robert's, then the realm stands upon a precipice. House Lannister, too. I won't pretend to condone any crime, but must the realm burn to avenge dishonor? If we can find a way to ensure stability without open war, I'd prefer that." Ned's face showed surprise. Perhaps he had expected Tyrion to threaten him, to cover up the scandal, or to lash out. But Tyrion believed that as Tywin's heir, his first duty was to preserve House Lannister from ruin and preserve the realm from destruction. His father had hammered that home. And the realm needed the Lannisters' gold to remain functional. To let war consume them all would be a fool's errand. Thus began a tense round of negotiations in secret. Tyrion confided in Elia what was transpiring, and she urged caution, knowing that if the truth became public knowledge, Dorne might also take advantage of Lannister weakness or join forces with other outraged lords. Eventually, Tyrion determined that he needed Tywin's direct input. He sent a raven summoning his father to King's Landing under a guise of important financial discussions. Tywin, rarely one to be summoned, nonetheless saw the gravity in his son's request. He arrived at the capital with a select retinue, ignoring Robert's grand welcomes and refusing to engage in feasts, going straight to the heart of the matter with Tyrion. The conversation that followed, behind closed doors in the Tower of the Hand, which Ned had discreetly loaned to them, was perhaps the most strained exchange father and son had ever had. Tyrion laid out the rumors, the near certainty that Jaime had fathered Cersei's children, and the potential for the realm to collapse in violent retribution if Robert discovered the truth in the wrong way. He observed Tywin's face grow taut as carved stone, saw the knuckles on the older man's hands whiten. Jaime was Tywin's firstborn son, golden and handsome, a knight who had once been the pride of House Lannister. Had Tywin not pinned that pride on Tyrion in later years? Cersei was Tywin's eldest daughter, now queen. The shame of incest threatened everything Tywin had built. The power, the legacy, the name. Yet Tywin was no fool. He understood that if Robert realized he'd been cuckolded for years, he would lash out, possibly even name an heir outside House Lannister or call for the execution of Jaime and Cersei. That would provoke Tywin into a war, and the realm would split. In that lonely room, with tapestries of hunting scenes on the walls, Tywin turned to Tyrion and said, in a voice like cracked stone, "You are certain?" Tyrion gave a single nod. "I have it from Ned Stark's own lips. He's found the truth in black and white, guided by old records and personal observation. The boy, Joffrey, he has none of Robert's features, nor do Myrcella or Tommen. They are all golden-haired. Jaime's spitting image." Tywin drew in a breath that hissed between his teeth. "Your brother, your sister, they have spat on our name with this, and if the king learns, he'll call for their heads." Tyrion dared not contradict him. He might, or he might do worse, incite a war that sees half the realm turned against us. Perhaps the Tyrells would align with us, or perhaps not, for if this scandal becomes public, we'd be the villains in many eyes. The Martells might recall old grievances. The Baratheons might try to rally Storm's End. The Riverlands might side with the North. I can't see a clean outcome without heavy bloodshed. Tywin's eyes narrowed. We must not let that happen. The Lannister name must stand above all. Thus, father and son considered how to contain the crisis. A clandestine arrangement with Ned Stark was the first step. The Starks, if they possessed proof, could threaten to reveal it if the Lannisters ever threatened them, but might otherwise keep quiet if certain conditions were met. Chiefly, that the children remain recognized as Roberts, thereby preserving the stability of the succession for the time being, and that House Lannister reign in its more dangerous impulses. Ned was not an extortionist by nature. He sought only peace and safety for his family and the realm. If Robert discovered the truth, it might tear everything apart. Tywin understood that if Jaime and Cersei continued their relationship, it would be an ongoing risk. Summoning them both, Tywin demanded they end it immediately. Jaime, shocked and ashamed, tried to protest, but Tywin's fury erupted in a low, leonine growl, ordering them to put House Lannister first. Cersei, defiant, spat that it was none of Tywin's concern, but Tywin roared that she had disgraced her mother's memory, disgraced the family, and placed their entire lineage in mortal peril. If the truth came out, Robert would not only end their line, but overshadow any hopes that Tyrion had painstakingly built for the Lannisters to become unassailable. Cersei's face was chalk white. She rarely saw Tywin's fury directed at her. She stormed out, threatening that Robert was an oaf, not worthy of her bed. Tywin did not yield. He told Jaime in a voice that was quiet but shook with restrained wrath, "Do your duty to the King's Guard. If the king must be protected from you, so be it. You will remain in King's Landing, and you will keep your honor." Tyrion worked behind the scenes to finalize the uneasy arrangement with Ned Stark. The Starks would remain silent so long as no harm came to them, so long as the Lannisters refrained from any more manipulations that might imperil the realm. Ned, in turn, would let Robert die believing his children were his own, unless circumstances forced his hand. Tywin grudgingly conceded that, for the sake of the house's future, they must allow this falsehood. Tyrion was the only one who recognized the profound heartbreak in Tywin's eyes, the sense that everything he had strived for was undercut by a scandal that could have been avoided had Jaime and Cersei honored the family name rather than indulging in taboo. In the aftermath, King Robert remained blissfully unaware, continuing his hunts and feasts. Tyrion kept a watchful eye, ensuring that no one else uncovered the secret. He found himself in the odd position of protecting a lie to keep the realm from sinking into chaos. Yet, in his private moments, he wrestled with guilt. How many times had he championed honor, championed the idea that House Lannister's reputation should be forged in gold, not in sin? But if the realm discovered the truth, war would be inevitable. He asked Elia, late one evening, "Am I playing the hypocrite, selling lies in the name of peace?" She placed a hand on his shoulder, her dark eyes solemn. "All rulers do. You rule through illusions, bargains, and sometimes falsehoods because the alternative is too grim. In Dorne, we have many who still thirst for revenge over Elia Martell's fate. But we hold our tongues, for we know open war with your family would devastate us both. Such is the cost of preserving the realm." So Tyrion suppressed any moral qualms and maintained the secret. He was aided by Tywin's iron control, by Jaime's guilty compliance, and by Cersei's forced acceptance that her father's wrath was more dangerous than Robert's scorn. Meanwhile, life in King's Landing continued. Ned Stark served as hand, diligently trying to manage the realm's affairs. Tyrion, quietly supporting him, oversaw certain financial reforms with the help of Littlefinger, who was cunning enough to realize that if the Lannisters fell, his own schemes might be jeopardized. Varys watched with intrigue, uncertain if the simmering tension might still boil over. But with Tywin's presence looming, the city was kept in check. No open violence erupted between the Lannisters and the Starks. Outside the capital, cracks were appearing in the realm's facade. Lord Renly Baratheon disliked the Lannister hold on power and whispered that Robert might be better replaced by a younger, more malleable king. Stannis Baratheon, sullen on Dragonstone, quietly investigated the parentage of the royal children and grew suspicious. He made overtures to Ned Stark to confirm his theories. Tyrion, keen on sniffing out such threats, eventually gleaned that Stannis was preparing to proclaim himself rightful heir if Robert died, on the grounds that Joffrey and the others were not Robert's seed. This was precisely the scenario Tyrion had feared. When Robert was mortally wounded by a boar on a drunken hunt, the crisis accelerated. At the king's bedside, Ned Stark had the opportunity to reveal everything or to keep silent. Cersei hovered there, Jaime present as well. Tyrion arrived with Tywin at the last moment. For Tywin had remained in King's Landing longer than usual, sensing something was amiss. The tension was thick as mud. Robert, delirious with pain, muttered final requests. He told Ned Stark to guide Joffrey until he came of age, to ensure the realm remained stable. Ned saw Tywin in the corner, saw Tyrion's solemn gaze, and realized that revealing the truth now would lead to an immediate confrontation. There, in that bedchamber, blood might spill. Swallowing his honor, Ned kept his vow of silence and told Robert that he would see the realm well managed. Robert died with illusions intact, though his final moments reeked of regret for a life spent in wine and gluttony. With the king's death, the crown fell on Joffrey's head, officially a Lannister in all but name. The courtiers bowed, the gold cloaks took up new positions, and the city braced for a coronation. Ned Stark found himself forced to remain as hand, at least temporarily, if only to prevent chaos. Tywin insisted that Joffrey be crowned at once, to forestall any chance for Stannis or Renly to raise a claim. Meanwhile, Tyrion worked behind the scenes to quell the storms. He negotiated a private arrangement with Renly, offering Lannister gold and potential betrothals to keep him from openly defying the crown. He dispatched envoys to Dragonstone, encouraging Stannis not to provoke a war that might tear the realm apart. In these desperate hours, Tyrion also used his father's authority to ensure that the gold cloaks were loyal. Many a captain and officer was offered sums of gold beyond their wildest dreams to remain faithful to King Joffrey. Meanwhile, Cersei reveled in the new status, though under Tywin's watchful glare, she was less reckless. She saw that her father was prepared to crush any sign of impropriety or wrongdoing that could see the family undone. Jaime, torn between his oath as Kingsguard and the knowledge of the lie at the heart of the monarchy, retreated into a stoic silence, occasionally confiding in Tyrion his guilt and confusion. Tyrion soothed him where he could, reminding him that the realm's stability was paramount. "Will not let the war ravage Westeros over your transgressions," Tyrion said as kindly as possible. And so it was that Joffrey ascended the throne, with Tywin as the power behind it and Tyrion as his father's voice in the royal court. Ned Stark, deeply troubled, attempted to maintain a moral compass in the midst of it all. The realm's lords watched, uncertain if they should hail the new boy king or take arms. But with the might of Casterly Rock, the gold that financed the crown's debts, and cunning negotiations orchestrated by Tyrion, no immediate rebellion ignited. Still, this was hardly a triumph of peace for Tyrion. He saw Joffrey's cruelty, recognized the boy's potential to become a tyrant if unchecked. Tywin recognized this too, and both men worried. The presence of Myrcella and Tommen, gentler children, did not solve the problem of a vicious boy king. But Tyrion tried to guide Joffrey's tutors, encouraging them to teach the boy restraint. Tywin, in his cold manner, warned Joffrey that a king who kills his subjects for sport will soon find himself without a kingdom. Joffrey, intimidated by his grandfather's steel will, tried to behave in the old man's presence, though out of that presence he indulged in petty cruelties. Amidst this uneasy climate, rumors came that the Targaryen girl across the narrow sea now had living dragons. Many scoffed, but Varys relayed increasingly convincing reports that Daenerys had hatched them on the funeral pyre of her Khal husband. Tyrion, recalling all he had read of Valyrian lore, felt a quiver of both excitement and dread. Dragons changed everything. Even the might of House Lannister might be tested by fire made flesh. Tywin refused to show fear, but began to quietly gather resources, forging alliances in Essos to spy on Daenerys. Joffrey, oblivious, bragged that if the Targaryen girl ever dared set foot in Westeros, he would have her head. Tyrion privately suspected it would not be so simple. Nonetheless, peace held in Westeros for the moment, tenuous though it was. The Northern Lords, seeing that Ned Stark remained as hand and that his family was not harmed, stayed their swords. The Riverlands, though uneasy about Lannister ascendancy, recognized that open rebellion was not in their interest. The Vale, governed by Lysa Arryn, was fractious, but Tyrion's envoy convinced her that independence was not feasible, especially with the crown's might. The Tyrells, placated with gold and privileges, withheld any challenge. Even the Iron Islands, unsettled as they always were, saw no immediate advantage in attacking. So the realm existed in a state of forced unity, held together by one unwavering truth. House Lannister controlled the gold and the throne. In this new environment, Tyrion thrived as the de facto power behind King Joffrey, albeit with Tywin overshadowing all. Cersei tried to exert her own influence, but Tywin's presence prevented her from descending into the chaos of her original timeline. Jaime, ever uneasy, served as Lord Commander of the Kingsguard now that Barristan Selmy had retired. A sense of wary equilibrium settled over the realm, and the small folk prayed that it would last. Tyrion's nights were consumed by memoranda from the Master of Coin, from spymasters, from regional lords complaining of taxes or bandits. He spent what little free time he had in the company of Elia, who was pregnant with their first child, a child who would unite Lannister and Martell blood. Tywin, seeing this new scion on the horizon, allowed himself moments of guarded optimism. Perhaps, despite the sins of his elder children, the future of the house was secure. He had placed his faith in Tyrion to guide the realm, to maintain the Lannister name as a beacon of power. Their uneasy alliance with Ned Stark was holding for the moment. If they could keep the realm from fracturing and keep the Targaryen threat across the sea contained, House Lannister might flourish for generations to come. Or so he hoped. But rumors are like the plague, impossible to fully contain. Whispers of Joffrey's true parentage found their way into the back alleys of King's Landing, and from there into the dusty roads of the countryside. Some insisted the boy was the product of incest, a demon in a golden crown. Others said the rumors were spread by Stannis and Renly to undermine the rightful king. Tyrion had gold cloaks arrest the most vocal rumormongers, but he knew that fear and curiosity could not be silenced by force alone. Still, as long as the major lords remained compliant, the rumors would not spark an outright rebellion. That is, until Stannis raised his banners on Dragonstone, declaring himself the rightful king of the Seven Kingdoms. Renly raised his banners in the Reach, proclaiming himself king as well, boasting the support of the Tyrells, for in this version, Mace Tyrell saw more opportunity in supporting Renly as a pliable figurehead than he did in opposing House Lannister directly. Thus began the War of the Five Kings, or so the small folk would soon call it, except it was not exactly the war we once knew. In the original timeline, the North would have joined under Robb Stark, the Riverlands would have rebelled under the Tully banner, and chaos would have engulfed the entire realm. Now, Ned Stark was still in King's Landing, bound by an uneasy alliance with House Lannister. The North was not so quick to rebel, for Ned's family was safe, and Tywin had guaranteed certain liberties for the northern domains. The Riverlands, similarly, had no cause to rise in arms so long as their Stark overlord was not in open conflict. So the wave of rebellion was narrower, with Stannis and Renly competing for the crown while House Lannister attempted to maintain control. Tyrion urged caution, pressing Joffrey to gather allies methodically. Tywin called the banners of the Westerlands. They planned to deal with Renly first, for Renly had the might of the Tyrells and the Stormlords behind him. Stannis remained perched on Dragonstone, formidable but not as numerous in men. In a carefully planned campaign, Tywin and Tyrion coordinated an overwhelming strike on Renly's host before it could fully mobilize. They marched with the lion's roar echoing across the Stormlands, forging alliances with minor lords who saw the Lannisters as the safer bet, particularly since the crown's gold guaranteed them handsome rewards. A decisive battle near the Massey's Hook saw Renly's lines crumble, and though the Tyrell cavalry was fearsome, they could not stand against the combined might of the Westerlands and crown forces. Renly was forced to flee toward Highgarden with a fraction of his men, while Mace Tyrell, humiliated, retreated into the safety of his fortress. Stannis, perhaps emboldened by the knowledge that the Lannisters were busy in the Stormlands, attempted to strike at King's Landing with ships from the Narrow Sea. Tyrion, forewarned by Varys's network, had placed wildfire caches in the Blackwater, prepared to defend the city with cunning illusions of strength. Tywin had left a portion of his army in the capital under Jaime's command. They set ablaze a portion of Stannis' fleet, forcing his men to retreat in disarray. Stannis cursed them as heretics and swore by the Lord of Light that he would claim the throne, but his attempt ended in a humiliating defeat that saw much of his navy sunk or captured. With the immediate threats of Renly and Stannis blunted, House Lannister stood triumphant. Joffrey sat on the Iron Throne in all his golden pomp, crowing about how the false kings had been shown their place. Tywin, as the hand of the king for Ned Stark, no longer willing to abide Joffrey's cruelty, had quietly resigned and returned to Winterfell under the pretense of urgent northern business, content to let the Lannisters sort out their own mess, presided over the realm with an unyielding grip. Tyrion was praised in some circles as the tactician who had orchestrated the city's defense. His father commended him publicly, saying that Tyrion had proved himself worthy of his rank. The small folk, though they feared a lion with too many teeth, still recognized that the Lannisters had spared them from the horrors of an extended war, at least for now. But victory came at a cost. Joffrey grew more insufferable with each triumph, believing himself chosen by the gods. He took to tormenting peasants, punishing minor slights with harsh sentences. Tywin tried to rein him in, but found the boy's temperament more vicious than he had anticipated. Tyrion recognized that if Joffrey were left unchecked, the seeds of rebellion would only grow. He and Tywin, behind closed doors, debated how to handle the monstrous child they had crowned. "We should have placed Tommen on the throne," Tyrion muttered on more than one occasion, "or Myrcella. Even Myrcella would be better than this little monster." Tywin, stern, retorted that removing Joffrey now would only raise questions about his parentage. "The realm believes he is Robert's heir. To remove him by our own hand would spark rumors that the Lannisters are fractious. No, we must keep him in place, at least until we can quietly orchestrate a transition. Perhaps in a few years, if Joffrey has an unfortunate accident." Tywin trailed off, letting the implication hang in the air. Tyrion took no pleasure in the idea of regicide, even of a false king. But for the sake of House Lannister, for the sake of the realm, it might be a lesser evil than letting Joffrey run rampant. In the meantime, Tyrion did what he could to mitigate Joffrey's excesses. He formed policies that improved the city's sanitation, hoping to appease the small folk. He coaxed gold from the Westerlands to provide bread subsidies, so the people might not starve. He convinced the City Watch to close their eyes to some of Joffrey's lesser commands, thereby reducing the number of petty cruelties inflicted daily. Over time, whispers spread that the dwarf Lannister was the real power in the city, that he was the only reason King Joffrey hadn't drowned King's Landing in blood. Elia gave birth to a son, whom they named Tywin Lannister in memory of Tyrion's father, though, to please her Dornish kin, they allowed him the acknowledgement of his Martell connections as well. Grandfather Tywin, who seldom displayed open affection, allowed himself a measured smile at the child's birth. Tyrion was overjoyed. In that moment, he felt all the illusions of scorn from his youth fade away. He was father to a child who would carry forth a legacy uniting House Lannister and the Dornish lines. Perhaps there was hope, after all, for a more unified realm, if time and circumstance permitted. As the months passed, tidings from Essos grew more alarming. Daenerys Targaryen had found allies in the city of Qarth, then in Astapor. Her dragons grew, a potent symbol that called sellswords and idealists to her banner. The rumor that she had freed thousands of slaves in Slaver's Bay and now styled herself the breaker of chains spread across the narrow sea. Tywin, not one to panic easily, nonetheless recognized the threat. The days of Aegon the Conqueror were not so distant in the collective memory. Dragons could topple entire armies. Tyrion pored over ancient texts describing how the realms had once tried to fight dragons. Most concluded that fire and blood would overshadow all but the cunning use of scorpions or subterfuge. The question was, would Daenerys Targaryen cross the sea to claim the Iron Throne? And how could House Lannister defend itself if she did? These concerns spurred Tywin to fortify alliances in the Reach, patching up the rift with the Tyrells by offering an advantageous marriage for Tommen. He would wed Margaery Tyrell, uniting the families and smoothing over the animosity that had arisen when Renly's rebellion failed. The Tyrells, eager to seat Margaery beside the throne, accepted, though they privately found Joffrey loathsome. The plan was to quietly push Joffrey aside in a few years, naming Tommen heir, and thus Margaery would become queen eventually, providing the Tyrells with the alliance they craved. Cersei, seeing her children treated as pawns, resented Tywin and Tyrion all the more. Her bitterness took the form of manipulative rumors and quiet sabotage. But Tywin's presence was still too daunting for her to make a direct move. She occasionally commiserated with Jaime, who remained in the Kingsguard, ever watchful, weighed down by guilt. He had lost a hand in the original timeline, but here still had both hands, still was considered a fearsome knight, yet felt no glory in his duties to the vile boy king who was, in truth, his own son. Thus, House Lannister was united in public, but behind the scenes it was an alliance of fractious hearts. Tywin commanded all with an iron will. Tyrion orchestrated the day-to-day governance that prevented the realm from plunging into chaos. Jaime maintained the facade of loyal Kingsguard, protecting the boy who was actually his blood. Cersei simmered, restricted by her father's overshadowing might. Elia quietly provided moral support for Tyrion, forging occasional links with Dornish allies to keep them content. The plan to eventually place Tommen on the throne, with the backing of the Tyrells, was the unspoken path to a more stable monarchy. But Daenerys Targaryen's star continued to rise. In time, news arrived that she had sacked Yunkai, Meereen, and established a burgeoning empire in Slaver's Bay. She was no longer a frightened girl. She was a queen with thousands of freedmen who adored her, and 3 rapidly growing dragons that personified her claim. A trickle of Westerosi knights and lords disillusioned with King Joffrey's cruelty slipped across the sea to join her. She gained spies who fed her intelligence on the fractious realm. Varys, slipping letters to Tyrion, confirmed that Daenerys might soon set her sights on Westeros, especially after hearing that Robert Baratheon was dead, replaced by a rumored Lannister pretender. One crisp morning, as the sun broke over King's Landing, Tyrion received a raven from an informant in Pentos. Daenerys had secured ships from the lords of Volantis. She was preparing a crossing. Tyrion, his heart pounding, took the letter straight to Tywin. They summoned the small council, which now included Pycelle, Littlefinger, Varys, and a Tyrell representative. The question hung in the air: how to repel dragons. Their immediate notion was to try subterfuge, as Robert once had, to have her assassinated. But Tyrion had no illusions that if Daenerys had come this far, if she had tamed dragons and conquered Slaver's Bay, some hired blade would not easily succeed. Tywin proposed forging alliances with the free cities, offering them favorable trade terms in exchange for refusing to harbor Daenerys' fleet. Some might comply, some might not. But time was short, and the Mother of Dragons was rumored to be unstoppable once she set her mind on conquest. While the court debated plans, Joffrey brayed that he wanted Daenerys' head on a spike, that he would show her and her dragons what true power looked like. Tyrion and Tywin exchanged a glance, each thinking the same thing. If Daenerys truly arrived with dragons, the Boy King's cruelty would be meaningless in the face of dragonfire. Yet, in all this swirling tension, House Lannister stood as one, at least outwardly. Tyrion and Tywin led the charge, preparing the capital's defenses, forging alliances in Dorne, the Reach, the Stormlands, the Westerlands, and the Crownlands. They poured gold into constructing scorpions and ballistae. Tyrion oversaw the production of wildfire to be placed along the city walls, hoping that if a dragon attacked, they might inflict serious harm. Ravens flew across the land, summoning men to defend the throne from a foreign invader. Even Stannis, licking his wounds on Dragonstone, might be compelled to join them against a Targaryen threat, for better to have a false Baratheon boy on the throne than a Targaryen with living dragons. This was the beginning of the final test for the Lannisters. All the cunning, all the gold, all the illusions of power, would it suffice against an ancient power reborn in flame? Tywin no longer felt certain. He placed his faith in Tyrion, in the cunning mind that had so often averted disaster. Tyrion, in turn, felt the weight of an entire realm upon his shoulders. He had become the favored child, the uniting force of House Lannister. He had bent the realm's events to avoid the catastrophic civil war that once might have erupted, but now the storm on the horizon was an exiled queen who commanded dragons. Tyrion knew that if they could somehow make common cause or sign a truce, that might spare countless lives. But would Daenerys Targaryen settle for half measures after she had come so far? If rumors were true, She considered herself the rightful queen of the Seven Kingdoms by blood, and might see the Lannisters as usurpers. Elia offered him a slender hope. Treat with her. Offer her something she wants more than war. The realm is large. Perhaps if you recognize her claim in some capacity, or offer her marriage ties. But Tyrion suspected that no arrangement would appease her if she learned that the Lannisters had aided in her family's downfall, if she recalled that the sack of King's Landing had resulted in the deaths of her kin. The blood of House Targaryen had been spilled by Lannister steel. Still, negotiations might be more appealing than open war with dragons. Tywin, though proud, was pragmatic enough to consider it. He sent envoys across the sea. They vanished or returned empty-handed, claiming Daenerys would only accept total surrender. Joffrey, enraged at the thought of kneeling, threatened to have any messenger with talk of surrender flayed. Tyrion realized that unless Daenerys could be swayed, House Lannister might face its greatest reckoning yet. In the end, no matter how cunning Tyrion was, no matter how unwavering Tywin's will, the day might come when fire and blood demanded a final answer. But for now, House Lannister stood united, with Tyrion Lannister at the helm of its cunning, Tywin Lannister enforcing its will, and the realm balanced precariously under a golden lion's paw. Joffrey Baratheon, in name at least, reigned over the Seven Kingdoms, though the real power lay in the father and son who had forged a unique bond out of tragedy and necessity, shaping Westeros in a manner none could have foreseen. Such was the legacy of Tyrion Lannister as his father's favored child. In another life, he might have been cast aside, scorned for the circumstances of his birth. But in this reality, he rose to unite the Lannisters under his shrewd vision, to stave off the worst of the wars that threatened the land, and to preserve a veneer of peace, even if it was woven of secrets and half-truths. Yet on the horizon stood a queen with dragons, ready to test whether even the combined brilliance of Tywin and Tyrion could triumph over the primal forces of House Targaryen reborn. The next chapter of that story had yet to be written, but all in King's Landing waited with bated breath, for the roar of lions might be drowned out at last by the thunder of wings and the roar of dragons.